Uh, I'm Seth Morrison, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Kehila Community Synagogue Middle East Peace Committee and JVP in the Bay Area chapter. The Middle East Peace Committee is one of three Kehila committees focused on Israel-Palestine, and they're also co-sponsoring this event. There's Face to Face, which is a Jewish Palestinian Reparations Alliance, and the Chavurah for Free Palestine. You can see details on those committees on the Kehila website. At Kehila, we always want to acknowledge that we're on unceded Native American land. And here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are on Ohlone land. Kehila as a community and many of us as individuals choose to pay the Shumai land tax. And I know there are versions of that throughout the country. And we hope that everyone will consider joining us in that. So it is now, and that link is now in the chat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program and the editor of Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, Carolyn Karcher. Carolyn is a professor emerita from Temple University, an amazing activist and a great friend. And Carolyn will introduce the book and moderate the panel. Carolyn?
Thank you so much, Seth. I want to begin by thanking Kehila Community Synagogue for hosting this talk, and the Middle East Peace Committee and the other Middle East committees and the JVP Bay Area chapter for co-sponsoring it. And above all, I want to thank Seth for organizing and indefatigably promoting this event. We try very hard to promote our events at JVP DC, and we've never succeeded in getting numbers like Seth managed to get here. So he's incredible. I also have been thrilled to see so many of my high school classmates in Japan who are attending this, this panel, even classmates who didn't tell me that they were going to be here. So I'm very moved, and I want to thank them especially. So let me now say something about the book. I got the idea for the book after hearing a number of people talk about how and why they stopped believing in Israel as a safe haven where Jews could escape persecution, or otherwise put, how and why they stopped believing that the solution to anti-Semitism was for Jews to have a state of their own, which they could control and which would privilege them over non-Jews. I decided to collect these stories with the aim of producing a book people could use as a vehicle for starting difficult conversations within Jewish families and communities. I chose the format of stories because I knew from experience that when people tell their own stories, honestly and sincerely, they can open the hearts and minds of others, especially when others can identify with aspects of these stories. Collecting the stories was quite a challenge. I began with a few acquaintances who I knew had interesting stories to tell. Moving beyond acquaintances, I solicited narratives from people who told personal stories at public events or wrote insightful articles, op-eds, or letters to the editor. This involved trying to track down the contact information of these people and emailing them a description of my project, often repeatedly before finally receiving a reply. To ensure that the collection reflected diverse backgrounds and perspectives, I made special efforts to seek out Sephardi Mizrahi as well as Ashkenazi Jews and Jews of color as well as white Jewish contributors. In view of the leading role that college-age Jews are playing in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I made it a top priority to enlist a significant number of them in the project. I quickly learned that putting out a call for papers on Facebook or on some website wouldn't produce results. The only thing that worked was personal solicitation. The next challenge was getting people actually to write and send in their narratives. About a quarter of the contributors had to be nagged and hounded, some until the very last minute. Still, I ended up with 40 fresh and deeply personal accounts representing a wide diversity, actually. Finding a publisher for a book titled Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism was the biggest challenge of all. I should mention that I'm not exactly a novice in the field of book writing. I've had 3 books and 5 edited books published by respected academic presses. But this book was aimed at a non-academic general audience, and the subject was controversial. I submitted proposals to about 20 presses with broad progressive readerships. Most didn't even answer my queries. Finally, I tried a press that specialized in controversial books about the Middle East, Interlink Publishing Group, whose founder and director happened to be Palestinian, and he snapped it up. He has been an ideal publisher, doing everything he could to promote the book by pricing it low. $20 is really quite low these days, and advertising it widely. We will be posting Interlink's website in the chat, and I hope you will not only order my book directly from them, but explore their wonderful selection of books for readers of all ages, including some innovative cookbooks. Now, let me give you a sense of my book's contents. The contributors are rabbis, professors of Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies, other academics, journalists and media specialists, lawyers, health professionals, social workers, activists, and recent graduates. They range in age from people in their 70s to their 20s. I divided the book into 5 chapters: Rabbinic Voices, Transformative Experiences in Israel-Palestine, Voices from the Campuses, Progressive Values versus Zionism, and Reflections of Leading Organizers. In addition to collecting and editing the narratives, I wrote an introduction and afterword to put them into a broader context. The introduction provides a brief history of Zionism and anti-Zionism from 1880 to 1948. Anti-Zionism is as old as Zionism is, by the way. And the afterword traces American Jews' changing attitudes toward Israel from 1948 to 2018. Of course, the heart of the book lies in my contributors' stories. We are fortunate to have with us today 4, we were supposed to have 5, extraordinarily articulate contributors who will tell you the gist of their stories. They are, in the order in which they will speak. First, Seth Morrison, a member of Kehillah Community Synagogue, is on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace Action. Now an energetic member of JVP's San Francisco Bay chapter, Seth used to be active in Jewish and Zionist organizations, including AIPAC. In 2011, however, he realized that liberal Zionism wasn't working, and he joined JVP. Second, Alice Rothschild, author, filmmaker, and physician, writes and lectures widely on human rights and social justice. She has authored 3 books on health and human rights in Israel-Palestine, and made a documentary film, a terrific documentary film, I should say, about Palestinian experiences of exile. Her latest book, hot off the press, is a young adult novel with a theme that subtly connects to Palestinian trauma. Third, Sidney Levy, former advocacy director of Jewish Voice for Peace, has supported BDS campaigns with both JVP and the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. He co-founded the first caucus bringing Jews of color and Mizrahi Sephardic Jews under the same umbrella. The 4th person, Ariel Gold, unfortunately is having her car towed right now and can't be with us, which I'm very sorry about. And I hope you'll be able to hear her on another occasion. 5th, Rabbi Alyssa Wise co-founded the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council in 2010 and went on to fill many leadership positions in JVP, ending up as its interim director. She's currently serving as a consultant to various human rights and Jewish organizations, as well as working with others on 2 book projects, including an anthology on Jewish Anti-Zionist Theology, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. Here's how we will proceed. I will ask each of the panelists to respond to 2 questions. 1, what role did Zionism play in your upbringing or in your early life? 2, what experiences led you to doubt and ultimately to renounce Zionism? Each panelist will respond in turn to the first question, then each will respond in turn to the second question. After that, we will open the floor to questions from the audience, which you should put in the chat. So, Seth, you're the one to start.
Well, thank you. It's really an honor to be here with so many great friends, both on the panel and in the audience. So my Jewish upbringing was not really Zionist in any classic way. I grew up on suburban Long Island, and my parents were members of a synagogue, and most of our social life was through other Jewish families. My sisters and I went to Hebrew school, and in Hebrew school, this is the 50s and 60s. We heard all these wonderful things about those brave Israelis, and we had the little white hats in preschool. So we were very aware of Israel, but nobody dreamed of Zionism or stopped to think about what Zionism was. The other thing that was, I think, interesting for me growing up especially in the 50s and early 60s, is that most of our clergy and Hebrew school teachers were Holocaust survivors. And we didn't really understand much about it. It was never talked about, but somehow it was one of those things that kids whispered about. And, in hindsight, it was obviously a beautiful thing for people who came here after being through all that to find that, the community supported them through these jobs. But I must say, as Hebrew school teachers, they didn't quite get it. And so I can't say I learned very much. And the change for me was first the 6-Day War, which was very exciting, and suddenly Jews were heroes. And even though we didn't have a lot of anti-Semitism growing up, we were very aware of being different. And suddenly we were heroes, and all these great things were happening. And then as I got into high school, my younger sister got involved in Young Judea as a Zionist movement, and I didn't really know much about what it was, but my sister invited me to join. And as I think back, I think it was probably mostly because I had a driver's license and my parents let me use the car, and the Young Judea group was one town over. But I got very involved and got hooked. So I will stop there. Thank you.
So I think Alice, you're next.
Sure. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. So I have a story with some similarities. I had Orthodox grandparents in Brooklyn who spoke Yiddish, and my parents were first generation. And we just lived with the general assumption that Jews were a persecuted minority. We needed a safe place, just in case, and that was Israel. But there was not a whole lot of thought that went into that assumption. My parents moved to Sharon, which was a small New England town in Massachusetts, where I just knew that Jews were, a distinct endangered tribe. This was a Christian town. I went to Hebrew school. My Hebrew school teachers were Israelis. So that's how I got to know Israelis. My parents joined a conservative temple. I had a bat mitzvah, and Zionism we didn't have the word for it, but just we loved Israel. That's how it was. And when I was 14, my family made the trip to Israel, and I have my diary from the time, and it was just this glorious trip. And with no understanding of all the things I understand now. I loved Israeli folk dancing. I loved the kibbutzim. And in particularly my diary, I could see I had a real disdain for Arabs. I had no understanding of Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews. We always put quarters in the tzedakah box, and I can't think of how many trees I bought and plant in Israel, and we were going to make the desert bloom. So I grew up with the Jews as victims, as feisty, as superior, and as deserving. Now, my mother was a writer, and she wrote a book. One of her books was called Voices from the Holocaust. So I was, as a teenager in the 60s, obsessed with the Holocaust, and I read everything I could find. I knew every person in town who had the numbers on their arms. This was very front in my brain. And so I grew up feeling like an outsider in a Christian world. And I had a taste of anti-Semitism in my little town where we moved in when I was 3, and it was about 4,000 people. And when I left when I was 15, it was 14,000 people, and all the people who moved in were Jews. And they were coming from the urban ghettos to be living in beautiful Serbia. And at one point, there was a town meeting where Jews were accused of destroying Christmas. So it was like made national headlines. It was like, ooh, this is not friendly. And then I went to a prestigious college where I met private school girls who'd never met a Jew before and would want to touch me because they'd never met a Jew. And when I started dating this incredible African-American guy who was at Harvard and was brilliant and wrote poetry, et cetera, my mother had like a major nervous breakdown. And she told me if I married him, which I wasn't, like I was dating him, that Hitler's dream would come true. So the Holocaust was, it was coming up as personal and public catastrophe, international crises all led to the Holocaust and to the need for Israel. So that's where my Zionism came from, and that kind of weird mix of the personal and the political.
Thank you, Alice. And now, Sydney, your turn.
Hi, I grew up in Venezuela, and my parents had been in the country for 5 years. When I was born, they had a difficult migration from Egypt to Venezuela. The Jewish community in Venezuela was evenly divided between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, but we were all very connected to Israel. And I went to Jewish school in Venezuela from kindergarten all the way to high school. In every classroom, we had 3 pictures on the wall. Simon Bolivar in the center, he's the liberator of the country, and to either one of his sides, it was in one side there was Herzl, and the other side Bialik. So we sang the Venezuelan national anthem, as well as the Israeli national anthem. At the beginning, it was every day, then it became only Mondays and Fridays because it was too long, but we were very, very connected. And there was no question about it. But I think that more even than the ideological connection between Judaism and Zionism, it's the fact that the Jewish community in Caracas, which is the capital of the country, replicated in so many ways what was happening in Israel. We were a very insular community of about 20 to 30,000 people living in a city of 3 million people, and we were all by ourselves. We lived in the same neighborhoods, knew the same people. I didn't have non-Jewish friends, sorry, only the neighbors in my building, but all of the rest of my life until the end of high school was connected to that small sliver of the city that were the Jews in the city. And that was by purpose, that was by design, because there was such a huge fear of intermarriage that the Jewish community kept us all closed in together. At the same time, my parents were leaders in the Jewish community and also in Zionist organizations. I moved to Jerusalem in 1980, and I became an accidental settler because I was in East Jerusalem. I was not aware that I was in East Jerusalem because I had no understanding of the Green Line. To me, Jerusalem in my head there were Jewish neighborhoods and there were what I called Arab neighborhoods. And the Green Line was separated by demography, not by history or by maps. Wherever the Arabs lived, that was not ours because it was mine. Wherever the Jews lived, it didn't depend on which part of the Green Line. That was ours because that's where the Jews were. Those were the concepts that I had when I moved to Jerusalem.
Thank you, Sydney. So now, Alyssa, I put you last because you're a rabbi, and I wanted to.
You just like to upend the social order of like, the rabbis are used to having the pulpit, so this time I shouldn't speak last. And I
Well,
just want to say,
It was giving you the last word.
I like it.
Not upending, giving you the last
I like
word.
it my version of like make the rabbis to the very end.
Not at all.
Hi. Hi, everybody. It's so fun to be here with you all. There's so many familiar names from my JVP days. It's really, I mean, I guess I'm always a JVP. I'm still a JVP day, just a staff JVP day. Yeah, it's interesting. It's so fun to hear you all talk, and fun. I don't know, maybe fun is an exaggeration. I resonate so much. There's so many similarities between the stories that you told, all of you. So I grew up actually in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is known for being the birthplace of the reform movement of Judaism, in the US, at least, the starting place. But I actually grew up in a modern Orthodox community there. And the way I got there is interesting. I don't think I've ever, this is not usually a story that I feel like I've told before about my family's origin to Cincinnati, but it feels kind of fun to tell here, which is my family moved from Lithuania to Palestine in about 1809. So way pre-Zionist. They moved to Palestine and lived inside the old city, inside the walls in Jerusalem. And later became part of the first 7 families. Some of you might have heard of Nachalat Shiva. So my family was one of the 7 families that moved outside the walls and started to settle West Jerusalem. And this was a story that was like had a lot, like, I don't remember ever learning it. It was always like just knowledge that it was like, it's very present. It wasn't like a historical thing. My family was like very much. And so like every time we went to Israel, which was very often growing up, we would go and take pictures at all the places that we knew the family used to live, and the street named after my family, which is my family line is the Rivlins. So up until recently, the president of Israel was a cousin of mine from this line. And so my great grandfather during the First World War was being drafted by the Ottomans into the army, and he didn't want to go. And a wealthy American was studying at his yeshiva in West Jerusalem. And his yeshiva friend said, I'll help you immigrate to the US and I'll set you up in Cincinnati distributing my family's kosher food products. So that's how my family began a kosher food distribution business for the Midwest. And that person was none other than Herschel Manischewitz. So my first uncle is named Herschel after Herschel Manischewitz. And it's like the most Zionist Ashkenazi story I can imagine. And so my family were kosher food distributors in Cincinnati. So I grew up in this very tight-knit Orthodox community that was extremely Zionist. And I never really understood why we didn't make Aliyah and move there. Like, it was very confusing. I was like, we love Israel so much. Why don't we go there? And so I grew up, actually, I learned how to organize, and I learned how to be a public speaker through going on talks as a teenager, to give talks along the lines of what Alice's mom said to her. I was like, if you date non-Jews, you will give Hitler a posthumous victory. And that was kind of how I understood my obligation in the world. I grew up going to Jewish day school, and my sense was like my obligation as a Jewish woman was to ensure the preservation of Jewish continuity. And I feel like in a certain way, I'm still in that line. I feel like my work to work for liberated and free Palestine is part in the best interests of the Jewish people, and that my work in this lifetime ought to be ensuring that the legacy that Judaism passes on is one that we can be proud of.
Thank you, Alyssa. So now everybody can think about the second question. What are the experiences that led you to doubt and ultimately to renounce Zionism? So again, Seth, please start off.
Sure. So, before I took you up through high school, in college, I stayed involved with Young Judea. I was a youth leader. I also, the sister who had introduced me to Young Judea went on their year in Israel, what we now would call a gap year. And I went to visit them. So that was my first visit. And of course, I saw all the standard tourist things that Jewish students see, and was therefore enamored. And after college, I worked for Young Judea for a few years as a youth leader. And then I got into my really planned career in cable television. And with that, ended up moving. It's funny, following Alyssa, that my first big move was to Cincinnati. I spent 5 years in Cincinnati building the cable system there and helping to run it. And, Jewish kid from Long Island, used to living in a fairly Jewish environment within the, percentage of my town that was Jewish. So what do you do to meet people outside of work? You go to a synagogue, you get involved in related stuff. There were a couple of young Judea people that my sisters knew, so they introduced me. And I started getting involved in the Jewish community. And, it became a social life. And it wasn't particularly Zionist focused so much as, focused on Judaism, focused on being superior, being different, and wanting to stay within the Jewish community. I then, for my next job, moved to Tacoma, Washington, and went through the same kind of thing, except that there the community was more involved in UJA, Jewish Federation, and APAC. And so my friends in the various young adult groups said, well, this is what we do, come with us. And so I went to an APAC conference in New York one year with them, and then the Seattle community did a mission to Israel. And of course, that was pure propaganda, but I have to admit I fell for it. And only then did I start meeting a few people who are on the more progressive side. One of them, who many of you probably heard of, is Gershon Baskin, who's been very involved in the coexistence world and has spearheaded some of the under the table negotiations with Hamas. And he had been a Young Judea member when I was, so I knew him. And, he was raising money for his work, and I happened to be on his list, and, got information from him about his interactions with Palestinians. And it really moved me and caused me basically to stop supporting AIPAC and to stop supporting Jewish federations. And I got involved in the New Israel Fund. Meanwhile, my youngest sister and her husband moved to a kibbutz in Israel with Young Judea called Keturah. And I visited them there a couple times. I met many of their friends. And they went through a process where agriculture in the desert wasn't profitable. They needed a new business. And thanks to one of the activists and one of my sister's close friends, that they started a program called the Arava Institute of Environmental Studies, which brought together Palestinians, Jewish Israelis, and North Americans to work on the environment. The theory there was that if young people come and focus on the environment, then they will also learn how to live and work together. And I got very involved in that and met many more Palestinians, traveled with some of them. I went to Ramallah, I went to Bethlehem with Palestinians, so I got a whole different view. And I started as a volunteer doing some fundraising for the Institute. And had I think a very meaningful story. One of the things the Institute would do would be to send a pair of students, one Jewish Israeli and one Palestinian, to come to the US to talk to Jewish communities and raise money. And I had a free day with one of them in DC, where I was living at the time. and they asked to go to the Smithsonian. So we went to a couple of Smithsonian museums, and then sort of mid-afternoon, we finished the one we were in, and I said, what do you want to do? What's interesting? And the Palestinian gentleman said, I know you guys have a Holocaust museum. I've heard all about this all my life, but I've never really understood what it was. Can we go there? Now, this was a time long, obviously, before COVID, but the Holocaust Museum was so popular that you needed tickets. You couldn't just walk in, but I said, what the heck? The three of us walked in. I went up to the counter to the young lady there and said, hey, I know I don't have a ticket. I know this is really odd, but I have a Palestinian guy here who wants to learn about the Holocaust. Can we let him in? And she didn't quite know what to do. So she called her manager over, and the manager said, of course, come in. And we had 2 very intense hours touring the Holocaust Museum. And when we got out, both of us were obviously very emotional. And we sat down and bought a cup of coffee. And I said, well, what do you think? He said, I never understood how terrible this was. And I understand how this could hurt people and make them worry. But how does it justify what they do to me at the checkpoints? And that really started me thinking and moving. Then the Arava Institute said, will you please fundraise with JNF? Because JNF, Jewish National Fund, is giving us money. And I said, they're Zionists, they're taking land. I can't work with them. And the executive director said, they're not so bad. They're not doing this anymore. They're changed. And the only way we could survive is to do it. So I did some fundraising with them. And then I found out that JNF was in the process of stealing some homes in East Jerusalem. And I freaked out. I said, I've been lied to. I've been misled. And I very publicly resigned and moved into JVP and have been, as Alyssa said, I think that the best thing we can do for the Jewish people as well as for the Palestinian people is to bring major change. And that is now my focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Your turn now, Alice.
Yes. So what happened to me is I went to college and I really lost a lot of my interest in Judaism and in Israel. I was pre-med, so I was just drowning in science courses. It was also the time of the Vietnam War, so I was becoming more politically active. I had stirrings of feminism. I also had a really dear friend in college who I would have never met before coming to college, whose grandfather had been the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And we had endless arguments about Arabs and pan-Arab nationalism, and all that kind of stuff opened my brain. And I realized that I had grown up like distrusting and hating Arabs, and I'd never actually met one. So that was like a crack in the wall. And then as I got into adulthood and survived medical school and residency and all that, I started reading books about colonialism and imperialism and Islamophobia and the other side of US history that I never learned. So my disconnect with Israel started becoming more and more troublesome. I wasn't that tuned into the 67 war and the occupation. I just knew something really bad had happened. And I also knew that like discussing this with my liberal family was like completely not going to happen. And so this kind of percolated along. And then in the 1990s, as we were heading towards the Israel 50th celebration, which in Boston was going to be like a big, massive thing on the Commons with Israeli bands and face painting and fireworks and yada, yada, yada. It sort of focused the mind. And so a group of similarly sort of disenchanted Jews from Workman's Circle, which is now Worker Circle, the End of New Jewish Agenda folks, and Kahil Ra got together and decided to start a dialogue group to see if we could understand things. So we started inviting Palestinians in the Boston area and lefty Jews in the Boston area to come talk with us and tell us their stories. And that was just like a thunderbolt. Suddenly we got this massive, very personal education, and it also challenged everything, and it also made all the pieces fit together. So this led to us starting an organization called Visions of Peace with Justice in Israel Palestine, which years later morphed into American Jews for Just Peace, which years later morphed into Jewish Voice for Peace. So it began my sort of involvement with these kinds of groups. Now, what we found was that we thought like, oh my God, the Jewish community needs to hear about this. They're blind. So we started doing community events, and we very quickly were blacklisted. I think a rabbi or the Israeli consul, someone would call and things would get canceled. So a bunch of us realized that we were doctors, and we were all in this group, and had the idea that we would try to understand the conflict through the lens of healthcare and human rights. Because whether you're a Zionist or not, I think you'd understand that it's not right for women to deliver at checkpoints. So we thought maybe we could use that as an opening. So in 2003, we started organizing annual health and human rights delegations to Israel, Palestine. And we did that almost consistently through probably 2015. And I went on almost all of these. And so I suddenly began to have these very intimate interactions with doctors and nurses and social workers, and staying in refugee camps and working in clinics. And, I went to Gaza 3 times. I got a very upfront, impersonal view of what is the cost of Zionism. And I also understood the cost not only to Palestinians, but to Israelis, as I watched Israelis get more and more militaristic and less tolerant. So the idea that the Nakba was continuing was very real to me. And that the idea that the peace process was basically all process and not peace was also very real to me. And I could see the cost of Jewish exceptionalism, whether it's under trauma or around water or security or, the racist demonization of Palestinians. So all this led to my really embracing the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which I began to see as, the most creative, powerful, nonviolent work I could support. And it's interesting you mentioned this museum experience. I was involved in hosting or working with a guy in Washington, D.C. who had come from the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. And he was there, and we were speaking together, and he wanted to go see the National Museum of the American Indian. So we went there, and it was a pretty devastating experience. He actually, we're seeing all these dioramas of Indian life, blah, blah, blah. And he actually had to leave. And, I was like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he said, in 100 years, we'll have museums with dioramas of Palestinian life. I can't stand this. So that was like, being slapped in the face. The other thing that happened was that I, with a group of people, organized an exchange program between Harvard Medical School and Al-Quds Medical School in Jerusalem. And I started having Palestinian medical students live with me while they were on this exchange for a couple of years. And so suddenly I'm meeting all these young people, and I'm seeing how smart they are and how dedicated they are, and how knowing that their hearts are going to be broken when they go back. And, so that was another very personal look at what is it like to be a Palestinian, really understanding, some of these folks had to like climb the wall and run from Israeli soldiers to get their visa to go to Boston. It was like, what, and through this, I started writing books. So I wrote 3 books, and I wrote a lot of op-eds and essays. And I also made this documentary film called Voices Across the Divide, in which I interviewed, I think 22 Palestinians. They all didn't get into the movie, but everybody, I sat down and said, tell me your story. What happened in 48? What happened in 67? Why did you grow up in Kuwait? People just spilled their guts, and people who hadn't, cried about this in 20 years were sobbing in front of me. So I got, again, this very intense understanding of what the Nakba and what dispossession means. And at the same time, I was on the receiving end of an incredible amount of pushback. I mean, social media, angry, racist, Islamophobic, I hope you get raped by 1,000 Arabs, but you would enjoy it, things like that, that really clarified what side I was on, and that Zionism was a form of racism, and that Jewish supremacy, and that Zionism was not Jewish liberation, which is what I sort of grown up with. So gradually my anti-Zionism really fit my politics. And I was able to build a community of pretty like-minded people where I felt supported and welcomed. And that was very different from like if I tried to talk in a temple, everybody was having a nervous breakdown. So I began to really separate Judaism as a religion or a culture or a ethnic group or whatever we are, which is a lot of different things, from Zionism. And I began to separate being Jewish from supporting the policies of Israel. And that seemed really important to do. And also, not only as a Jewish person that has this state that says it speaks for the Jewish people, which I don't think it does, but also as a US citizen, I just felt this tremendous responsibility for what was happening there. And I began to understand that the treatment and solidarity of Palestinians was a major civil rights issue internationally. It was no longer this little thing between Jews and Palestinians, and that it really intersects with all these other struggles like Black Lives Matter and fight against police brutality and racism. Suddenly, these all began to come together for me in a big way. And like others have said, I feel like how we as a Jewish community handle our power and privilege, which we have, is really critical to the survival of an ethical Jewish tradition, if it's going to survive at all, because that's what I'm proud of. And it's also critical if we're going to build a just and lasting resolution to this struggle, which has gone on, for more than a century and is being fought in our name. So there's all these layers that I think we absolutely need to do this.
Thank you so much, Alice. Sydney, you're up next.
Yes, thank you. So I mentioned that I come from a very insular Jewish community in Venezuela. So when I moved to Jerusalem in 1980 to study Jewish history, I continued the insularity, but the circle grew a little bit. So actually I stayed 7 years in Jerusalem, and most of my contacts were not with Palestinians, who at the time I called Arabs, but they were not even with a lot of Israelis. The insularity grew up a little bit, so most of my friends were Latin American Jews in Jerusalem. I had some Israeli friends, but most of them were, oh wow, there are Jews from Peru and from Mexico and from Argentina, and it was great to speak Spanish in Jerusalem and to have this bond. Now, I did meet Palestinians, and it was a very, very simple way of meeting them. It was by accident, because I lived in the dormitories at the Hebrew University, and the Hebrew University had a policy. I don't know if it was a written or unwritten policy. We had 10 rooms in each floor, and with a common bathroom and a common kitchen. And in each floor, 1 room was reserved for Palestinians, and 9 rooms were reserved for Jews. And I never understood why until somebody explained to me that that was a way to make sure that Palestinians didn't congregate, that they felt isolated. But the end result of it is that every time that I went to the kitchen to prepare food, Palestinians were there. So my first contact with them was over maps. We took over maps, and I very arrogantly started discussing with them. I was new. I barely spoke Hebrew. I spoke some Hebrew. I was like a few months in the country, and I started discussing to them, this is mine, this is yours, because the land was mine. And I was trying to understand what I was going to give them. That was the first moment where I basically had any connection with Palestinians, and it was a very arrogant, a very difficult and embarrassing way of starting the connection. My next step was in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, and in my head, the invasion of Lebanon that Israel went all the way to Beirut was similar to my understanding of the Vietnam War. Now, I wasn't in the United States, so I only saw the Vietnam War movies, but I understood that Israel needed to get out of Lebanon. That was an easier understanding because it was not connected to Palestine. It was connected to one country invading another country, and that was wrong. There was also the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. That was very shocking. But what the Lebanon invasion did was 2 things. It shattered the myth that Israel was a moral country. It also shattered the myth that Jews exceptionally were moral, like in total, because I participated in anti-war demonstrations in Jerusalem, one very infamous where Emil Grünzweig was killed by a grenade thrown by another Israeli Jew. And so to all of those people that were surprised many years later saying, how is it possible that Rabin was killed by a Jew. Jews don't do those things. I was like, yeah, I saw it in 1982. These things do happen. We have the same capacity to do evil as any other person, or the same capacity to do good. So I stayed in Jerusalem until 1987, and I could relate to what happened in Lebanon. I could even relate to the occupied territories. I actually, which is 1967, I went to many talks by Professor Yeshayahu Leibovich at the Hebrew University, and he was famous by the fact that he could talk about any subject. He would talk about, for example, the role of women in the Kabbalah, or any subject, because he knew about so many things, and always invariably his talk would end in the Israeli occupation. You knew that he was going to make a seamless transition from whatever he was talking to the Israeli occupation. So I understood 1967 well, and I was against the occupation, but I couldn't get anywhere close to 1948. When people would ask me about 1948, I would say Palestinians and Israelis are like Siamese twins. And I don't want to deal with separating them. It was just too difficult for me to even think about it. So I left Jerusalem in 1987, came to the United States, and I decided, and this is a lot of privilege, to take a break from having to think about the Middle East. So I came here, I studied, I got my visa, my green card, and I just cleaned my head of trying to think about Israel and Palestine. And this is a lot of privilege that you can have when you are not oppressed. Things came back to me with the Second Intifada, and I realized that I needed to take action, but I only felt safe taking action among Jews. And that's when I joined Jewish Voice for Peace. It was very important for me that I was in a group of Jews, because in my head, if you were criticizing Israel and you were not Jewish, most likely you were anti-Semitic. So doing it in a Jewish context felt safe. So I became involved with Jewish Voice for Peace. I started meeting non-Jews that were critical of Israel with the U.S. campaign against the Israeli occupation that now is called the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And that was the first time that I actually met non-Jews that were critical of Israel. And I actually felt very much at home and very safe, to my surprise, because at the beginning I was so scared about non-Jews talking about Israel. The issue of the Nakba was very hard to swallow. I only got to understand the Nakba through the lens of what is called the New Israeli Historians. Because if it was Palestinians telling their stories, I wouldn't have believed it. Even though I knew that Israel was not necessarily the most moral country and all of those things, the Nakba was something that was hard for me to swallow. I needed Israeli Jews to say that that was true, so that then I could start listening to Palestinian voices. This is, again, it's little by little breaking the insularity and breaking the Jewish exceptionalism. Once I got to accept that the Nakba is a historical fact, and actually the Nakba continues to this day, but that took me more time to get to understanding the continuous Nakba. Once I understood the 1947, 1949 Nakba, then the issue of the right of return came to the table. And it was very hard to swallow also, because I really strongly believe in a Jewish demographic majority. And I wrapped my head for years around this question: how can we keep a Jewish demographic majority and hold the right of return? Because I am an immigrant. My parents were immigrants also. I understand the rights of refugees. It's just that there was an exception for Palestinians. I just couldn't go there. It took a long time to get there. And in that process, I started moving away from Zionism, but in the softest way. So the way that I would explain it is, Zionism is a good idea. It was just poorly implemented. So that was the first way of getting out of Zionism. Then saying things like, Zionism is a good idea, but cultural Zionism, not political Zionism. So there was always a way of defending Zionism while trying to explain why it went wrong. Finally, I had no choice. Really, it was no choice but to accept the right of return, and to accept that there is a contradiction between having a Jewish majority by force and having a democratic state at the same time. I remember going to the first J Street conference in Washington, D.C., and there was this speaker who was talking about how to talk to your families about the Israeli occupation. And he actually came and said, I'm going to give you a clue. I'm going to say, and I'm going to give you demographic information. The bad news is that Palestinians have more babies than Israeli Jews. The good news is that if we meaning American Jews, but he actually meant Israelis, get rid of the occupied territories, we are going to be able to keep a Jewish majority in 1948. And the good news is that Palestinians little by little are having fewer children as the economy goes up. I raised my hand at that time and I said, look, I'm coming from California. And if somebody were to say, there are too many Latinos in California and the bad news is that whites are going to be a minority in California, I would call that racist. What you're saying is racist. It took 30 years to get to that point, to understand the racism that was inside of this concept of a forced Jewish majority that is at the basis of Zionism. The reason that it took me a long time is that I came from a very insular place, and I think that I am an example that anybody can change. Hopefully people will do it much faster than I have done it, but anybody can change. And that's our job, to change people's hearts and change people's minds. And by the way, it's not just our jobs as Jews to say so, but as Jews to make sure that with our privilege, we open the door so that people can hear Palestinians saying so. People do not need to hear it from us. People need to hear it from Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Interestingly, 1982 was the turning point for me too, coming out of the Vietnam War and seeing the similarities. And that was my beginning. So again, Alyssa, you get the last word.
It's so great to hear and be and feel like there's so many pieces I'd love to like dig in, and like maybe in the Q&A if people are curious, to put these pieces together about our common experiences, right? Because my story actually starts same as Sydney's, which is at Hebrew University. Yours didn't start there, but I also had my big moment of transformation happened at Hebrew University in 1999 when I was spending my junior year abroad there. As I said, I was confused about why my family, if they were so Zionist, didn't move to Israel. And so I was determined to do that. So my idea was to spend my junior year at Hebrew U, and then like, if all went well, kind of stay there indefinitely. Partially because, I was raised in a very gender segregated environment. And I, felt like I didn't quite understand how to be Jewish, which I felt very strongly if I wasn't in that religious framework. And as I went to college and started developing, I wasn't a leftist at that time. I went to Israel by any stretch of the imagination, but just started having like nascent political uprisings in me. So one of my first days on campus, by this point, I had been to Israel many times on Jewish Federation missions with my family. I had gone in high school on a trip where we went with my camp, where we went and visited concentration camps. I don't know if people are familiar with these trips, but we went for 10 days and visited all the concentration camps in Poland, and then flew to Israel for 6 weeks. And the whole premise, and it was kind of baked into me, like the education I got at my day school and the education and the sentiment growing up was really like, it was a steady diet of Holocaust in Israel, but it really like reinforced this idea that not just about anti-Semitism, but that somehow the project of Israel was a leftist political project, like a social justice enterprise. And I kind of thought of it that way. So on my first days on campus, there was a protest happening, and they had a flag wasn't familiar with, and they were talking about an occupation. And I remember like going up to the table of Palestinian students who were hosting this protest, and I was like, occupation, land without a people, for a people without a land. Like, I think I basically even said that, which is humiliating to think about now. But the student was like very generous with me, and we became friends, and they gave me It was particularly this young man who I became friends with, and he gave me a lot of things to read. And so I started this process of like a year-long unlearning of everything. And of everything that I had been taught growing up. And actually the most radical thing I read that year was David Ben-Gurion diary, because he spells out the Nakba in very explicit detail. Right. I felt this sense that my teachers and my family had been lying to me. Like, why didn't they tell me? Right. Like this like ugly truth about the founding. It was right there in David Ben-Gurion's diaries. So then there was this like next plot point that I think of as I started moving away from Zionism, that started to crack it. The next piece was that during that year, I started going to the West Bank with Rabbis for Human Rights. And that was also a little bit of my root of becoming a rabbi myself, because I started to understand that women could be rabbis and things like that, and going in that direction, and started going to teach English in Bedouin villages in the West Bank. And I just got a more upfront, started to develop relationships and understand that. The next plot point during that same year was that I had a scholarship from the Jewish Federation for my year at Hebrew University. And part of the scholarship was to go lead Passover Seders in the Ukraine. The setup was like 2 Ukrainian college students and me and another American. And we got a translator and a van, and we traveled around for the week of Pesach, leading Passover Seders for the Jews that were left there. And we went actually through the shtetl on my mom's side, where they had lived. And part of it was also funded through this group called the Joint Distribution Committee that tried to bring people basically from around the world to Israel. And so in some of our conversations with the Jews in the Ukraine, we would be like, why don't, especially when we met young people. It was one thing when there were older generations at these seders, and it was very rare actually to have young people there. But I remember one conversation where there was somebody who was in their maybe late 20s, and kind of complaining about the lack of Jewish life and connection. And I remember saying, well, why don't you move to Israel? You can have this vibrant life there. And I remember him saying, well, if I move to Israel, who's going to take care of the cemeteries? And the Jewish cemeteries in particular. And it really struck me. There was something about it. And it's the one conversation I remember from that whole trip, but it really was this next level of oh yeah, this is where I'm from. Why are we turning our back on this part of Jewish culture that was decimated, but also there are still embers burning there. And why are we not putting our energy to restoke the fire of Jewish life in this place where Jewish life thrived, or if not thrived, at least happened for many generations. And I had this sense of loss of that part of me, but it wasn't intellectual. It was just visceral. And then the final plot point of that year was, after that year was over, I was too politically a mess. So I came back to the US. I didn't end up staying there indefinitely, though I stayed for a whole year. And when I came back, the same scholarship that took me to Ukraine asked me to run a fundraising campaign on my college campus. And shortly after I returned, about 2 weeks, is when the second Intifada erupted. And so I decided to try to organize with my scholarship money a vigil. And my idea was it was going to be a rabbi and a priest and an imam, and it would be a peace vigil. And it was in September 2000, right? Really just on the heels of it. And I had never organized anything like that before, but they threatened my scholarship for it. And I didn't understand, because to me, I wasn't being a heretic. I was you all raised me, the people who gave, the Jewish Federation raised me and taught me my leadership skills. And I then went and had this experience and tried to bring at Hebrew U and bring my experience back to the US and have this sense of working for peace. And the fact that this peace vigil was so threatening to them was very illuminating and shocking and unnerving. I was very naive and didn't really understand. So I decided to move to New York the next year, because I was there's all kinds of crazy Jews in New York. There's got to be some Jews who are like me, because I didn't know anybody else who was going through the same kind of experience. And there were, and I found this wonderful group called Jews Against Occupation. And we met every week on Mondays at the CUNY Grad Center on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And we would have like 50 to 60 people every week. This was right at the outset of the Second Intifada. And the people who were there were like veteran activists from the ACT UP era or from the Vietnam War, or feminists, a lot of like queer and lesbian feminists that kind of taught me like I wasn't a leftist at that time. I just had this visceral breaking of my sense of self and my sense of allegiance to Zionism. And there's a lot more I could say about my Jews Against Occupation years. But it was very, very transformational. And actually I ended up becoming a rabbi in part because one, I remember some of the Shministim, who are these Israeli refuseniks, these high schoolers that are saying we refuse to serve in the army, were coming in 2003 to New York, and we were Jews Against Occupation. We called ourselves JADO. We're trying to organize a speaking tour. And me and another friend were like, let's call through all the liberal synagogues and see who'll host them. Very naive. And I remember we like hung up the phone on the last one of the like Reform or Reconstructionist, like congregation in New York, where the rabbi was like, are you kidding me? Like, and usually they were not very nice. And my friend turned to me and was like, you went to Jewish day school, you're an organizer, like go be a rabbi. And then there'll be rabbis who are like us, who can welcome us and organize in the future events. So it's particularly healing and sweet to be invited today to have this conversation through a synagogue. And through a sacred community. So it feels like exciting to feel like the healing of these original hurts are happening kind of swiftly in my own lifetime.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's exactly the way I feel about being hosted at the synagogue after many, many tries and much difficulty in getting a synagogue to invite people like us. So we can now open the floor to questions. And if people have questions, we can dive right in. And if not, I have a question prepared just in case. So let me know how it is.
So while people are thinking, I just had a synagogue experience too, that I'll share very quickly, because I wrote this young adult book. It's called Finding Melody Sullivan, which you would never know is a book about Palestine, but it is a subversive stealth book about Palestine. And I was invited by a JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace rabbi at Kadima, which is a Reconstructionist temple, to both talk to the grown-ups in the temple. And then I did a discussion with the Bar mitzvah class. So it was like, oh my, this is very different than 30 years ago when this would never have happened. So I think we see the subversive rabbis having their impact.
Thank you. That's very, very heartening. Any questions yet?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try to start things off by asking a
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
Yes? Oh, David
Just got a
Mandel.
question. Yes.
Yes.
We are asking people to put their questions in the chat, please. Give a minute. If people have their hands raised, if you could put your questions in the chat, that would be most helpful. But a number of comments in the chat about people who are inspired and appreciate all the feedback. So I want to make sure the panel all sees that. What is the title of the book, Alice? If you could put it into chat. And second question is, can we listen to this again? And the answer is yes, we are recording, and we will send out the link to the recording to everybody who registered, and it will be on YouTube.
Wonderful. So are there any questions in the chat that yet? And I know David Mandel was one of the names that I saw with a question, and the second person with a hand up, I didn't catch the name.
Yes. Go back. A couple of questions just came in. First one was that I'm in the UK, and I was wondering what solutions the speakers would offer to the ongoing prejudice and hostility they are testifying to. So question is, what solutions do you recommend?
Are they talking about prejudice and hostility to Jews in the UK? Is that what the question is?
I'm going back and looking. I think the prejudice, the question is, we've talked quite a bit about the prejudice that we have as Jews towards Palestinians and frankly towards non-Jews. And how do we break that? So any of the speakers want to volunteer?
I mean, I read it as the prejudice and hostility from Jews towards people like us.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So I could say a few words on that. So I am very strategic in who I'm talking with. So if someone is absolutely dug in, Israel right or wrong, go to hell, there's no point in talking to that person because I'm not going to move them. They're not going to move me. So I think it's very important to work with people who are on the edges, or the people who are uncomfortable, or the people who are beginning to see, the intersectional relationships. I also think that it is very important to work with younger generations, because we know from, surveys that younger generations are much more open to Palestinian narratives, Palestinian trauma, putting Jewish trauma, making Jewish trauma less exceptional, not treating Israel as an exceptional country that can't be criticized. So I think that doing work with those groups, whether it's cultural work, showing films, reading books in schools, having panels, going on trips to the region that are not birthright trips, but are actual trips that help you to know what's going on. That's how you do the work. You do it on the edges. I don't think you do it with the mainstream, rigid people that are not going to be moved, because they're not, but maybe their children and their grandchildren will be.
I can give some suggestions as well. I think that a number of things. First of all, I think Jews feel under siege for real reasons, but also because we are using the wrong definition of anti-Semitism. When we conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, then yes, there is a growing siege, but we need to be clear about what the definition of the problem is so we can talk about it. So that's number one. The other thing is just understanding the similarities where we can point to how things, I just gave the example of California before, where we can point how things work in here versus how things work in there. So I'm going to talk about Jews in the United States. In the United States, we are very strong as Jews that we don't want minorities to be oppressed. We don't want mixing of church and state, because it is against our interest to have this be a Christian nation. So how can we be supporting Israel the very same things that protect us and provide us safety in this country? They are contradictory. And the moment that we understand the contradiction, then the moment that we are going to get into an anti-Zionist position. Telling stories is very helpful to get there. But this is inherent contradiction that is between our role and our place here in this country and what we try to defend in Israel that we need to highlight again and again.
Well, and I think, Sydney, you just answered beautifully the next question, which is, what do you tell Jews that tell you that they're worried about needing Israel as a safe place for Jews? And I think, comparing it to the United States is we're safe because we're one democratic state, because we believe in freedom of religion and do our best to fight racism.
Yeah, if I could also piggyback onto that. I don't know of any other beleaguered minority that thinks that safety lies in having its own territory from which it can exclude or ethnically cleanse other people and maintain a demographic majority. African Americans are not asking for that. Latinos are not asking for that. Asian Americans are not asking for that. Indigenous Americans are not asking for that. So this is, it's a very unusual solution if you put it in the context of other people's, other oppressed people's experience. The answer that JVP offers, which I think is a wonderful answer, is that you fight against all forms of racism and oppression. You band together with all peoples who are subjected to forms of racism and oppression. And that's the best protection against anti-Semitism, as against racism, against any form of racism. And making anti-Semitism be a special case actually causes resentment. It doesn't help you fight. It doesn't help you fight against anti-Semitism. So I agree with Sydney, and I think that that's where our work needs to lie, in reinforcing the ideals, that the best ideals that have kept people safe, and that in America, and that that we're still defending, because of course this country has never fully lived up to its ideals or its pretensions, and we're trying to make it do so. But that's our job, and I think doing that kind of job is the best job for fighting against.
Can I just play off against the anti-Semitism question? Because I think we have to be real that anti-Semitism is present in the United States. It's growing. And that's not anti-Semitism as defined by criticism of Israel. It's anti-Semitism of the older school type. But I think the other thing that's very useful for people who are afraid of anti-Semitism is to look who the anti-Semites are in the US and broadly. These are the most fascistic, racist, ultra-nationalist, skinhead type people are the people that are driving anti-Semitism now. And that's very different than people who criticize Israel. And the interesting thing is that those kind of folks hate Jews, but they love Israel. And they love Israel because it's an ethnically pure, militaristic, anti-Muslim, anti-Iran kind of state. So I think you have to be really clear that anti-Semitism is a problem, but we have to look at it and tease out these layers.
I'll jump in. Can I jump in on this piece too? Because I think there's one other thread that I think is important to highlight. And Carolyn, I was thinking about when you were speaking about, like these people aren't looking for this same model of nation state that Israel is advocating for itself. And I think that actually, to understand why that is, we have to go back to the beginnings of Zionism. And because when Theodor Herzl first was advocating, right, for Zionism and building the Zionist movement, he himself kind of like internalized this idea that there was a Jewish problem in Europe, and it had to be fixed by doing something with the Jews, right? And so it wasn't originally that it was going to be this Jewish state would have to be in Israel-Palestine, right? There were other places that were proposed. And one of the reasons that Israel-Palestine ended up being the spot is actually because of Christian Zionism. And I think Christian Zionism gets let off the hook a lot in our conversations about American support for Israel. I think there's one of the realities is that the most well-resourced pro-Israel organization in the US is Christians United for Israel, which boasts more members than the entire Jewish population of the United States. So they boast about 12 million members. There's roughly 7 million Jews in the US, right? And they, the beginnings of Christian Zionism go back to Herzl, right? Lord Balfour was himself a Christian Zionist, right? And they were advocating for settlement in Israel-Palestine to hasten the second coming of the Messiah. And that is still to this day what animated a lot of the Trump Israel agenda, right, is this eschatological promise that if enough Jews move to that land, have a critical mass, it'll hasten the second coming. And then at that point, right, this is something that the leader of Christians United for Israel, Reverend John Hagee, has said many times, Jews either have to convert or burn at that point. There's like literally nothing more anti-Semitic than that. And yet last year, Christian United for Israel's #1 advocacy priority was the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which seeks to equate anti-Zion critique of Israel, really, and anti-Semitism, right? So I think that we need to look at from the beginnings that there was this Christian influence, this Christian Zionist influence in precisely the way that advocating for quote unquote Jewish safety was being imagined, right? And it wasn't that there weren't people who even noticed that then. And actually next month, a quick pitch, if people are curious, next month, I'm going to be teaching a 4-part course at SEDEC Chicago, another radical synagogue to be talking about. And where we're going to be studying the writings of Rabbi Aaron Samuel Tamaris. And he was an anti-Zionist rabbi who actually went to the first World Zionist Congress, and his writings about that experience and why he rejected Zionism from the very jump, related to the ways that he saw how all these anti-Jewish dynamics were playing out inside the like nascent idea of Zionism.
That's wonderful. I look forward to that.
So we only have a few minutes left. A couple of questions that popped up. What I'd like to do is I will read out the questions, and each of us can take about a minute to talk about those that are that you're most comfortable with. So one question was, who were the new historians? How has your relationship with your family changed? What is your view of the future? And how have the various definitions of Zionism caused some of this confusion? You know, the more religious, historic, sentimental tie to the land versus the nationalist. So I know each of these could be a book or more, but let's just take a minute each and focus on what you think is most important.
Could I start with the new historians?
Sure.
And I want to recommend the works of Ilan Pappe, P-A-P-P-E. To me, he's the best by far of the new historians. And you can begin with his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which is only 200 pages long and which is really puts everything together beautifully. He also has an autobiographical book about how he was persecuted and driven out of the University of Haifa. Just read Ilan Pappe and that will be great.
All right, who's next? Alice, you're muted.
State the questions, one at a time. They just
Sure.
kind of too many piled up.
How have your relations with your family changed? Do you have a quick view of the future and what the outcome we'd like to see? And how do you feel that the confusing definitions of Zionism affects how people think about these issues?
Well, I can say that my parents are now dead, but my mother said to me, I respect what you're doing, but you're breaking my heart. So I got to see the last generation have its heart broken. But I'm happy to, and also I have no relationship with any cousins except for 2, because everybody is totally enmeshed in Zionism. But my children are with me. So that's the trend.
Does somebody want to address the vision of the future?
Well, for me, I think that one state is the only possible fair outcome. I do find that there's a lot of innovative discussion of how to share the land in the Swiss model of cantons. So you could have communities that focus on their own culture, but total freedom, one person, one vote.
I think that for me, the vision of the future, for the longest time, I used to say the vision of the future needs to be discussed over there and not by us here. But at the end of the day, we talk about the vision of the future for other countries of the world where we are not part of. So Israel is not an exception. I would put two R's in it. One is return. It's a right and it needs to happen. And the other is reparations. It's not just return. There needs to be an affirmative focus on decolonizing. That doesn't mean that the Jews that live there need to leave. It means that the balance of power needs to be shared equitably, not just return. So return is just the beginning of it. Now, I just wanted to mention quickly about the relationship with my family. I think that my family knows where I stand. They don't agree with. And frankly, sometimes my mother asks me whether I am Arab or not. Well, my parents are from Egypt. They are the Arabs. I am too. But she asked that question as if to say, are you Palestinian or are you with us? And sometimes, frankly, they ask, are you doing Passover? And the question implies like, well, if you support Israel, are you really Jewish? But, we love each other. We agree to disagree, and that's the end of the story.
Melissa, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, there's too much to say about the relationship with the family. It was rough. My family's a little bit, in my immediate family, all of my brother does real estate development in Israel. My dad, the kosher food distribution company went under in the 90s in globalization, but my dad works now for an Israeli food company. My mom has her own PR business and works for Zionist organizations. So it's all still part of the family business. So it's been very stressful for the family. And we've kind of more or less reached we don't talk about it policy in order to stay in each other's lives. And it's hard, during rabbinical school, when I was studying to become a rabbi, I spent my summers in the West Bank doing human rights observation work in the Salfit region, where we would document human rights abuses by Israeli settlers and army. And I kept a blog of it while I was there. And I came back to learn that my brother had started a rival blog, which was every time I posted on my blog, he donated money to the Friends of the IDF in the US and would write a thing about it. But I didn't know when I was there. So that's how it all started. It was very extreme, was very intense. But we now kind of have made peace. When I told them I was going to become a rabbi, they were like Sydney was saying, like, you are like, it just didn't make sense to them that I would have these politics and be dedicating my life to serving and teaching and being part of Jewish community. I do want to say one word about the Zionism question, because it does come up, but I think that, the way that and this is how I think about it, is that there were once upon a time when there wasn't the state of Israel, or when the state of Israel was nascent, that there were different ideas about how Zionism could look. But the reality is that there's one kind of Zionism that exists today in real time, right? Like, and there's something about saying that there's different kinds of Zionism when Palestinians are living under the boot of a specific iteration of political Zionism, which is like has behind it, right? The Israeli government, the Israeli military, 3.7 or whatever the current number is of billions of dollars from the US government. So it feels like the conversation about, sometimes I feel when that question is asked about what kinds of Zionism, it's like a false question, given that Palestinians are living under, we're living with a certain, the one that has become dominant, which is the Jewish centric political Zionism.
Great. Carolyn, any closing comments? We're right at the half hour.
I want to again thank Kehillah Community Synagogue and echo what Alice and Alyssa have said about what a healing experience it is to be able to have this program in a synagogue and be welcomed here. So I'm very moved by that, and I really thank you. I really thank Kahila. And again, I want to thank you, Seth. You have been such a role model, and you've done so much to enable and to promote this event. I want to thank Marty, our tech person, without whom none of this could have been possible. And I want to thank the audience. You've asked wonderful questions. You've been very patient. And again, to see members of the audience here who I really didn't expect to see, it's been quite thrilling for me. So thank you, all of you.
Great. And on behalf of Kahila, we also want to thank everybody, Carolyn and all the speakers. I do urge you to check out the Kahila website. We have the 3 committees. The Chavurah for Middle East Peace has a in-person event on Tuesday night. It's a dinner to hear from Palestinians about their Nakba experience. And we're coming up on Nakba Day, which is the Palestinian commemoration of ethnic cleansing. There are events going on around the country. Wherever you are, please check out those and come out to support the Palestinians. Thank you all very, very much. And we will post the recording as soon as possible. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Few people still getting off, but just really want to thank everyone. This was very impressive. And Marty, thank you for all your great support.
And thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Sydney. You were great.
You did a great job, and thank you for giving me so many ideas in my discussions with people.
Oh, thank you, Najla. It's great to hear your voice.
Yes,
Okay.
it is good to see you. I see
Thank
you on
you.
Facebook every once in a while.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Do you want to do any debriefing stuff?
Sure.
Seth?
There's still a few people on.
Right, I'm just kicking people out.
Okay.
So folks, if you can go ahead and